Hello again. Welcome back to American Myths and Legends. And we're still in the Old West, and we're going to talk about another famous American legend, Calamity Jane. Now, Calamity Jane was a real person. The real Calamity Jane looked like this. The legendary Calamity Jane looks more like this. She was a real person, and it was her who started telling tall tales about herself. Her legend grew when a writer named Edward Wheeler paired a character he called Calamity Jane with a made-up character named Dead-Eye Dick in a series of dime novels in the late 1800s. The books were so popular that people began confusing the lives of the character Calamity Jane and the real one. Even Calamity Jane started to confuse her own real-life adventures with those that the writer wrote. So, here is the story. The Wild West was really wild back in the 1800s, and it was up to the United States Cavalry to tame it. And Martha Jane Cannery rode with them as a scout across those big dusty plains. She was the first woman to serve in the Army in uniform, if history is right, or so the story goes. Some say she could outride, outshoot, and outboast any soldier in the Army. She was the most courageous soldier ever to ride into battle. And she would tell you that herself, if she had the chance. Maybe it was true, and maybe it wasn't. One of Martha Jane's boldest adventures happened on one dusty day in Wyoming. A rowdy gang of ruffians came into a miners' camp to steal the gold the miners had spent months digging out of the ground. Martha Jane and her fellow soldiers had been ordered to chase off them varmints so the miners could get back to work at the mines. They rode into camp. Bang! Suddenly there was a rifle shot, then more. The skirmish was fierce, with fighting all around. Martha Jane took two of the galoots by surprise, letting out a whoopee-yi! It so startled the ruffians that they were knocked clean out of their saddles. They hightailed it on foot back to Canada and never once looked back. Another shot sounded. Martha Jane looked in the direction of the shot. It was Captain Egan. He had been shot and had fallen off his horse. Martha Jane spurred her horse and galloped straight toward the captain. Later that afternoon, Martha Jane tended the captain's wound. He said, "Martha Jane, you're pretty handy to have around in a calamity. From this moment forward, I name you Calamity Jane, the heroine of the plains." And that's how Martha Jane came to be known as Calamity Jane. And a calamity is when a terrible thing happens. But she was always there to make sure it was put right. Martha Jane was an unusual child. Legends usually are. When she was delivered by the stork in 1852, it didn't bother dropping her into a cradle. Oh no, it set her down on top of a horse, and Martha Jane rode from that day forward. She took to horses the way a fish takes to water. She became such an expert rider that by the age of 3 she was training the wildest of the beasts. By the time she and her family set out for Montana, she was also a crack shot with a rifle. Pa said she could pick a pheasant out of a field blindfolded while standing on her head. It's a good thing, too. During that 5-month journey, her family and the other pioneers in the wagon train sometimes ran out of food. Martha Jane always came through. She would gallop her horse right alongside the men in the hunting party. Then, before the men could even take aim with their rifles, Martha Jane had dinner ready to cook. Well, the journey wasn't all riding and hunting, of course. When the pioneers were fording streams with their wagons, sometimes Martha Jane took a swim back and forth just for fun. One time, however, the raging river swept her quickly away. Everyone in the wagon train feared the worst. Then suddenly, a half-mile downstream, Martha Jane popped out of the water. She said, "That was refreshing. Anyone care to join me?" There were no takers, so she jumped in and swam back upstream in time to help the last wagons across. That Martha Jane, she was fearless. Well, take the time. The family's wagon train met up with a band of Native Americans. The Indians did not take kindly to the pioneers coming to settle their land. They thought it was their land and the pioneers shouldn't be there. Well, the band of Indians circled the wagon. The pioneers didn't know what to expect. They thought it might be the end. But it wasn't the end. No, not by a long shot. Martha Jane jumped on her horse and rode it out to face the Native Americans. Of course, she did it in her own way, balanced on her head. The Indians had never seen such a sight. As quick as a cricket can hop, they decided the young rider was a bad omen. They thought it best not to tangle with these pioneers, at least not as this long-haired, strange, red-haired apparition was among them. Word spread after that. From that day forward, Martha Jane could ride among any of the Native Americans and received the greatest respect. Well, by the time Martha Jane became Calamity Jane, she knew the frontier as well as a calf knows its mother. The United States Army asked her to be a scout. It was while scouting for the Army that Calamity Jane was ordered to join up with General George Armstrong Custer. That was in 1876. Now, between time courting fame and posing for pictures, the general was marching to the Montana Territory. He was charged with driving out the Indians, many of whom were camped on the banks of the Little Bighorn River. Well, fate must have been looking out for Calamity Jane, because she never made it to the Bighorn River. She took sick. Along the way, she forded the Platte River, dripping wet and freezing cold and trying to put more miles behind her than was ahead of her. She got pneumonia. She was taken back to camp and kept in the hospital for 14 days. As it turned out, getting pneumonia was a lucky mishap. The general and his troops were killed right there on the banks of the Little Bighorn River. Today we call the bloody battle Custer's Last Stand, and so it was. All of the soldiers with him died. Well, when Calamity was able to ride again, luck smiled her once more in the form of a fella named Wild Bill Hickok. He was a famous lawman, and Wild Bill was as dashing as Calamity was daring. The two were meant for each other, and to hear some folks tell it, mostly Calamity Jane, that's just the way it was. Together they set out for the town of Deadwood, South Dakota. The pair was as happy as a snail in its shell for a while. Then misfortune struck. While sitting at a gambling table, Wild Bill was shot dead by a fellow named Jack McCall, a notorious outlaw. On hearing the news, Calamity hunted down the no-good killer and single-handedly brought him to justice. Only a fool would tangle with Calamity Jane. Through the years, Calamity held a number of jobs. She delivered mail and money between Deadwood and Custer, South Dakota. It was one of the most rugged trails in the West, thick with thieves, but the bandits left Calamity Jane alone. They knew she was an expert shot, and they did not want to take any chances. Even so, she still had adventures. Folks say that one time a tiny bee was about to take a bite out of a cow in a herd. That would spook the whole herd of cattle and cause a stampede. Before the bee could strike, Calamity Jane lassoed the bee and saved the day. Another time, she saw a stagecoach at some distance, bringing more settlers to the west. The horses were galloping at full speed, and the driver was keeled over in the seat. A gang of robbers chased behind it. So Calamity spurred her own horse into action, and when she caught up with the coach, when she was close enough, she leaped upon the lead horse and brought the stage safely to a stop. As soon as the robbers saw Calamity saving the stagecoach from disaster, they hightailed it in the opposite direction. Calamity held down many jobs and had many adventures throughout the West, but she always returned to the Black Hills. Before she died, she made one last request. She said, "Bury me next to Wild Bill, you hear?" Friends saw to it that she was buried next to Wild Bill. And I have a song about Calamity Jane. It's an old song that I wrote last week. And it goes like this. Get my hand ready here. Calamity Jane, Calamity Jane, the West ain't been the same since Calamity Jane. She was the roughest, toughest cowgirl in the West. At riding, roping, shooting, she was the best. I tell you how I know, Calamity told me so. Then many other folks made up the rest. Calamity Jane, Calamity Jane, the West ain't been the same since Calamity Jane. She was a scout for the Army and rode for the Pony Express. At catching outlaws running, she was the best. She could tame a wild horse, track a river to its source, and if you want more stories, you can make up the rest. Calamity Jane, Calamity Jane, the West ain't been the same since Calamity Jane. Oh, Wild Bill Hickok fell in love with her. Well, that's what they say, but it ain't so sure. But Calamity said it was, and all agree because I ain't no fool to disagree with her. Calamity Jane, Calamity Jane, the West ain't been the same since Calamity Jane. All right. Well, I got more. I got one more American myth and legend, all about Bigfoot. So I'll see you on the next video, American Myths and Legends, Part 6, I think it will be. Yeah.